Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are taking a really close look at the paradoxical nature of a beverage that literally fuels the modern world, coffee. The central question we are exploring is this. Is coffee actually good for you, acting as a health-promoting functional beverage that increases longevity and vitality, or is it killing your energy, acting as this disruptive stimulant that traps us in a cycle of dependency, energy crashes, and disrupted biological rhythms?
Yeah, and it is a question that affects nearly everyone's daily routine, often multiple times a day. Our analysis today emerges from a really comprehensive review of recent source material, encompassing massive epidemiological studies, clinical trials, and deep neurobiological research on both caffeine and coffee consumption. The data presents this fascinating tension between the systemic benefits of the coffee bean itself and the neurochemical costs of its primary active ingredient.
Precisely. And in today's discussion, I will be arguing that moderate coffee consumption is a fundamentally protective, life-extending dietary habit, supported by overwhelming population-level data.
And I will be taking the position that caffeine's daily interference with our natural neurochemistry creates a biological debt. I argue that it ultimately erodes our baseline energy and our sleep quality, often doing much more harm to our daily vitality than we consciously realize.
Let me begin by establishing just how robust the data supporting coffee actually is. We are not talking about small, isolated, or observational studies with tiny sample sizes here. I am framing coffee as a potent, health-promoting functional beverage because the epidemiological evidence is frankly staggering. According to a recent meta-analysis of 40 independent studies encompassing roughly 3.8 million individuals, we see a distinct 15% reduction in all-cause mortality for those consuming about 3.5 cups of coffee a day.
A 15% reduction across the board?
Exactly. That is a massive population-level survival benefit. When we look at the composition of coffee, it is one of the richest sources of polyphenols and chlorogenic acid in the modern diet. These compounds offer profound systemic benefits. For instance, the research demonstrates a 29% reduction in type 2 diabetes risk. It shows vital neuroprotection, significantly reducing the incidence and progression of both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's diseases. And the data shows massive benefits for the liver, what we call hepatoprotective effects. We are talking about actual reductions in liver scarring or fibrosis, and even a lowered risk of liver cancer, specifically hepatocellular carcinoma. I mean, when you look at the macro-level health outcomes, coffee is undeniably a life-extending intervention.
I do not dispute that the epidemiological data exists, nor do I deny that the coffee bean itself contains beneficial antioxidants. But looking only at the macro-level survival data completely ignores the daily mechanical effect of caffeine on the human body. What we are really talking about is an energy loan, and it is a loan with a notoriously high interest rate.
An energy loan? How so?
Well, caffeine does not create actual cellular energy. It does not provide fuel in the way a macronutrient does. It merely masks your fatigue by blocking adenosine receptors in the brain. When you consume it chronically, you trap yourself on what the research calls the caffeine energy roller coaster. Because your brain is constantly having its adenosine receptors blocked by caffeine, the brain adapts. It thinks, I am not getting the signal, so it creates more receptors, a process called upregulation.
Which leads to tolerance.
Exactly. It leads directly to tolerance. The result is the dreaded afternoon crash, fragmented slow-wave sleep at night, and a gradual, undeniable erosion of your natural baseline vitality. You might be getting polyphenols to protect your liver, but you are mortgaging your neurochemistry to get them.
That is a very common interpretation of the crash, but attributing that entirely to the coffee bean is placing the blame on the wrong culprit. The crash you are describing is not an inherent flaw of coffee itself. Rather, it is an issue of user, timing, and dosage. The mechanics of energy and the so-called inevitability of the afternoon crash can be entirely mitigated if we just work alongside human biology instead of against it.
I have to push back on that because the crash is deeply biological and entirely linked to the adenosine blockade I just mentioned. Let's break down how adenosine works. Think of it as cellular exhaust. Throughout the day, as your cells use energy, your body produces adenosine as a metabolic byproduct. It builds up over the hours, and that buildup is what signals sleep pressure to the brain. Because caffeine shares a very similar molecular structure to adenosine, it basically slots into those receptors like a fake key, blocking the actual exhaust from registering.
Right, it sits in the receptor but doesn't activate it.
Precisely. And this is the critical part. Your body does not stop producing that cellular exhaust just because you drank a latte. The adenosine keeps building up in the background, like water behind a dam. When the caffeine's effects finally wear off, typically after about 5 hours, the dam breaks. That massive accumulated reservoir of adenosine floods the receptors all at once. That is what causes a severe physiological crash characterized by sudden fatigue, irritability, and brain fog.
And I agree that the flood happens, but that flood only ruins your day if you are deploying caffeine improperly. Think about the classic image of someone staggering into the kitchen like a zombie and immediately hitting the button on the coffee machine. We have all been there. But biologically, if you drink coffee the second you open your eyes, you are stepping on your body's natural alertness mechanism and setting yourself up for that exact afternoon dip.
Because of cortisol?
Yes, specifically the cortisol awakening response, or CAR. When we wake up, our adenosine levels are naturally at their lowest, and our cortisol naturally peaks to clear out residual sleep inertia. If you delay your first cup of coffee for 90 to 120 minutes after waking, you allow the cortisol to do its job. By the time caffeine is introduced 90 minutes later, the natural peak is subsiding, and the caffeine amplifies your alertness rather than overriding your body's own mechanisms.
But even if you delay the intake, you are still initiating the blockade. And what about the secondary crashes? If you are consuming high doses of caffeine, you stimulate increased insulin secretion. That causes a secondary blood sugar crash that works in tandem with the adenosine flood, completely exacerbating the exhaustion. It is a biological inevitability of the molecule's mechanism of action.
That secondary blood sugar crash is usually the result of the sugar and milk people add, not the caffeine itself. And we cannot ignore the functional enhancements. Caffeine actively stimulates the release of dopamine and beta endorphins. These are neurotransmitters that genuinely improve mood, enhance cognitive focus, and provide highly tangible benefits to physical performance. For example, the source material notes an average 17% performance increase in runners who utilize caffeine. That is not just a masking of fatigue. That is a functional, measurable enhancement of human output.
Optimizing the morning run is great, but we have to consider the hidden neurological costs of maintaining that heightened state of output every single day. You are focusing on the active hours, but I am looking at the long-term cost to our restorative cycles. Let's run the math on chronic sleep disruption. Caffeine has a half-life of roughly 5 to 6 hours.
Which means half of it is cleared by the liver in that time.
Right. So that means if you consume a cup of coffee at 2 p.m. to fight off the very afternoon crash we just debated, half of that caffeine is still actively circulating in your system at 8 p.m. A quarter of it is still locked into your brain's receptors at 11 p.m. when you are turning off the lights and trying to go to sleep. This lingering caffeine directly suppresses slow-wave sleep.
But total sleep time isn't necessarily reduced for everyone who drinks afternoon coffee. Many people fall asleep just fine.
Falling asleep is not the same as resting. It is not just about the total hours you are unconscious, it is about the architecture of the sleep itself. Slow wave or deep sleep is critical. Think of it as the brain's dishwasher. It is the phase where the brain clears metabolic waste and consolidates memory. Chronic interference with this restorative process degrades your mental clarity the next day.
And the compounding effect of that.
The user wakes up feeling groggy, which forces them to consume even more caffeine that morning just to reach a baseline level of function. This builds the exact tolerance loop I mentioned earlier. Eventually, you reach a state where you need a 7 to 14-day complete cessation period, going cold turkey, just to reset your adenosine receptor density back to normal. That cycle of chronic sleep disruption is exactly why I argue it is killing our energy over the long term.
I acknowledge that sleep hygiene is paramount, and late-day caffeine consumption is certainly a behavioral error. However, we have to zoom out and look at the net systemic outcomes over a lifetime. If chronic sleep disruption were universally eroding our health due to coffee, we would see that reflected in the morbidity and mortality data. We would see shortened lifespans and higher disease burdens. But we see the exact opposite.
You are referring back to the 3.8 million people study.
Yes, and specifically to what the data calls the J-shaped curve of protective benefits. This is where the data gets truly fascinating. We don't just see a straight line where more coffee equals better health or more coffee equals worse health. We see a J-shaped curve. This means there is a distinct biological sweet spot, usually around 3 to 5 cups a day, where you are extracting the maximum neuroprotective benefits of the antioxidants right before the negative side effects of the stimulant start to take over. Within that sweet spot, the risk reductions are phenomenal. We are looking at an 11% lower risk of heart failure at 4 servings a day. We see a 21% lower risk of stroke. We see massive reductions in endometrial cancer.
I understand the J-shaped curve, but again, you are attributing those benefits to the whole beverage when the stimulant is causing unseen friction.
But here is the piece of evidence that I think perfectly counters the idea that we are just borrowing energy at a massive neurochemical cost. Decaffeinated coffee also shows many of these exact same longevity benefits.
Wait, decaf shows the same statistical benefits for longevity?
Yes, extensive analysis in the source material indicates that decaffeinated coffee offers similar reductions in incident cardiovascular disease and metabolic syndrome. This is the smoking gun. It proves that the positive, life-extending effects are driven by coffee's powerful antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds, like the chlorogenic acid we discussed, not merely the stimulant effect of caffeine. The vehicle itself, the brewed bean, is extraordinarily healthy, regardless of the caffeine content.
The presence of antioxidants is undeniable, and the decaf data is an incredibly strong point for the bean itself. But we have to be realistic. It does not negate the fact that the vast majority of people are drinking the caffeinated version, and they are doing so specifically for the stimulant. When we look at these broad population recommendations, you cite the epidemiological data as if 3 to 5 cups is a universally applicable prescription. I challenge that universal label entirely because it completely ignores profound genetic and biological individuality.
The data sets encompass millions of individuals across wildly diverse demographics. The protective associations hold true regardless of age, weight, or smoking status. I argue it is one of the most universally accessible lifestyle interventions we have to extend a person's health span.
The population averages might look great on a chart, but they hide severe individual risks determined by our DNA. Let's unpack the alphabet soup of genetics here, because there are profound variations in how human beings process coffee. Let's look at the CYP1A2 gene. That gene dictates the speed of caffeine metabolism in your liver. Then you have the AHR gene, which controls enzyme activity. And you have the ADORA2A gene, which affects your central nervous system's actual sensitivity to stimulant effects.
So you're talking about the difference between fast metabolizers and slow metabolizers?
Exactly. For a genetically slow metabolizer, your recommended standard dose of 3 to 5 cups can be highly disruptive, even dangerous. Their liver just doesn't clear the molecule fast enough. It can cause severe anxiety, significant blood pressure spikes, and cardiac arrhythmias. For these individuals, the half-life of caffeine isn't 5 hours, it might be 8 or 10 hours. That magnifies all the sleep disruption issues we just talked about exponentially.
I am certainly not suggesting that someone who actively experiences arrhythmias or severe anxiety should force down 5 cups of coffee just to chase a longevity statistic.
But the broad recommendations in the media often gloss over these contraindications, and they are serious. Let's look at prenatal exposure. The source material highlights a linear dose-response relationship between caffeine intake and pregnancy loss. That is precisely why major health organizations strictly limit prenatal exposure to under 200 milligrams a day, which is about 1 standard mug. And some data suggests even that comes with risks.
Pregnancy is certainly a unique biological state requiring distinct medical guidelines.
It is, but it goes beyond pregnancy. Furthermore, we have to talk about preparation methods, because how you brew the bean changes its chemical composition. Unfiltered coffee like French press, Turkish coffee, or espresso contains high levels of compounds called diterpenes.
Which impact cholesterol, correct?
Yes, diterpenes can significantly raise LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol levels. So imagine a slow metabolizer with existing lipid issues who starts drinking 4 cups of unfiltered French press a day because they heard it extends longevity. They are actually doing active harm to their cardiovascular system. Preparation method and genetics matter immensely, far more than a generalized J-shaped curve suggests.
Acknowledging that genetic outliers exist and that certain demographics require specialized medical guidelines does not invalidate the general rule. I entirely agree with you on the necessity of personalization, and I will readily concede that excessive consumption, pushing beyond that 5-cup threshold, negates the health benefits. I will also concede that relying on highly sweetened, calorie-dense coffee shop beverages or synthetic energy drinks creates massive blood sugar fluctuations that are terrible for metabolic health.
So the delivery system matters.
Absolutely. But we must not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. When we isolate the habit to a moderate intake of filtered black coffee, the evidence overwhelmingly points to a net positive for longevity for the vast majority of the adult population. Filtering the coffee removed the diterpenes you mentioned, protecting cholesterol levels. The antioxidant profile of a black, filtered cup is simply too robust to ignore. It improves glucose balancing, increases fat oxidation, and systematically reduces the chronic inflammation that sits at the very root of nearly all age-related diseases.
I agree that filtered black coffee is the safest and most beneficial delivery system if one is going to consume it. And I certainly agree that avoiding the excessive sugar found in modern drinks is vital to avoiding those secondary insulin crashes. But I cannot emphasize enough that the psychoactive properties of caffeine must be respected. Even if you are a fast metabolizer, relying on an adenosine blocker to power through a modern high-stress lifestyle is a dangerous game.
Because it obscures our true state of rest.
Exactly. It masks underlying exhaustion. If you are sleeping poorly, stressed out, and using coffee just to push through the workday, you are not extending your health span. You are simply covering up a physiological deficit. The antioxidants might be protecting your liver, but the stimulant is degrading your sleep architecture. It creates an unsustainable cycle of biological debt.
It seems we are arriving at a deeply nuanced understanding of this incredibly complex beverage. To summarize my perspective, when we view coffee through the lens of long-term epidemiology and metabolic health, it truly stands apart as a net positive. The data from millions of people over decades of research simply cannot be dismissed. Moderate coffee consumption, specifically filtered black coffee, acts as a powerful neuroprotective and cardioprotective habit. It clearly mitigates the risk of devastating conditions like type 2 diabetes and Parkinson's disease, and ultimately it extends lifespan. Yes, it must be used correctly, and we must honor our biological timing, but its role as a health-promoting functional beverage is thoroughly cemented in the scientific literature.
And to summarize my position, we must respect our neurochemistry above all else. While I fully acknowledge that the coffee bean contains highly beneficial, even life-extending compounds, the way we consume the caffeinated beverage often undermines our daily vitality. Relying on a psychoactive adenosine blocker to artificially orchestrate our energy cycles risks masking deep underlying exhaustion. It degrades the slow-wave sleep that is absolutely non-negotiable for brain health, and it builds a tolerance that requires ever-increasing doses just to feel normal. We have to be honest with ourselves about the biological debt we accrue when we try to outsmart our own fatigue.
I think we have found some very important areas of convergence today. We both clearly agree that extreme doses and the highly sugared synthetic energy drink equivalents are universally detrimental.
Absolutely, and we also firmly agree that individual genetic tolerance must dictate a person's consumption. A blanket recommendation of 3 to 5 cups does not work when liver enzymes and receptor sensitivities vary so wildly from person to person.
We are also aligned on the critical nature of strategic timing, implementing a morning delay to respect the cortisol awakening response and strictly avoiding afternoon coffee to protect our sleep architecture seem to be essential practices for anyone looking to maximize the benefits while minimizing the harm.
It really highlights the sheer complexity of balancing our short-term energy management with our long-term health outcomes. There's so much more to explore in the source material, particularly regarding the intricacies of our personal genetics, fast versus slow metabolizers, and the deep mechanics of sleep hygiene.
Indeed. It leaves our listeners with quite a bit to consider regarding their own daily routines and natural energy cycles. Ultimately, it comes down to understanding your own biology, listening to your body's true signals, and making an informed choice about how you choose to brew your morning cup.
Thank you for joining us for this analysis.
Until next time.